Time's up. That completes our first round, and now we go to our 5-minute round, starting with Dr. Carrie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And again, a great panel. Thank you all for being here. I wanted to get right to my questions because we do know that this is rolling out in 288 days. There's not a lot of time, and I think it's a really missed opportunity. We had Colorado here earlier saying that really before you get this rolled out, you should be having your public education program in place, really good factual information. We don't see that there. Data collection should be in place, treatment research, things along the lines. And for the last 2 years, really, the Liberal government hasn't really been doing anything. And again, we're jamming all this into 1 week. And I just want to particularly thank Mr. Larsen for being here. I think you're the first person we've had that's on the ground actually integrating and talking to the public about this very important issue and transformative piece of legislation anyway. So I'm going to throw out all my questions, and I'm going to throw them out all to you because I only have 5 minutes. And I've got, I think, 4 main questions I'd like you to answer. First of all, there's a lot of questions about cannabis by parents, educators. What do you do for your clientele for education? And when they have questions for you, do you have scientific, basic pamphlets, things along those lines? Where do you get your product? How do you assure quality control? And I'm curious, what would you say a good age cutoff would be? And I'm not talking for medicinal use, I'm talking just for recreational use. So those are 4 questions. I probably only have 4 minutes left for my time. Would you be able to comment on those 4 questions, please?
Can you give them to me one at a time again so I don't forget all the questions?
First of all, what do you do for your clientele as far as education is concerned?
Okay, I'll just take, so for that one, it depends what they're coming in for, you know, but if we try to guide them to the right product, sometimes people come in, they're experienced with cannabis, they've used it a lot, they're just looking for a particular product, they don't need a lot of guidance. We also get senior citizens who come in, say, I haven't used cannabis in 50 years, my grandson says it'll be good for my arthritis or something. We don't typically stick a joint in their face. We normally give them edible products or CBD-based products or creams or tinctures or things that are going to have less psychoactivity and more of a medicinal effect. So we try to guide them based on what they're looking for and what their experience is. And like other things, we always tell them, start off with a small dose and then work your way up until you get to the point where you're getting the benefits or whatever it is that you're seeking. So that's the kind of guidance we try to give.
It's like written type of guidance?
Mostly oral. We have some written information and pamphlets and things like that too. It depends, but a lot of it's just personal conversations with people and a one-on-one discussion, like you'd have with a pharmacist or a doctor looking for guidance on cannabis. Sometimes they have a doctor's advice going in, but Canadian doctors don't really know a lot about cannabis or the endocannabinoid system, which is part of our body system that the cannabis interacts with. So
do your
mostly
employees have training?
Yeah, we try to give them training. It varies, but we make sure we talk to everybody. And if they can't answer the question, we make sure we have somebody there who can.
Okay. Second question, where do you get your product?
It's from the illegal market by definition. We have no choice. There's no legal place for us to get it. Some of them are people that have been growing cannabis for years. Some of them are licensed under the medical program to grow their own cannabis, and they might have some extra that they Health Canada wants you to destroy it or just dispose of it if you have too much. Well, they dispose of it by selling it to a dispensary. There are many people that make edibles and extracts and things at home, and a lot of them don't meet our standards. The majority of what gets brought to us we reject because it's not the right quality or doesn't meet our needs. But it comes from the black market by definition. But we do our best to make that the lightest shade of gray it can possibly be.
2 more questions. Again, you were talking, you reject a lot of it. What do you do for quality control? And then a really important question I'd like your opinion on age. Okay, for recreational use, what do you think a cutoff age would be? Sure.
Well, for quality control, it's a challenge because we're not able to access Health Canada certified labs. They will test our cannabis if we have someone who's legally allowed to possess, send it in. But if I put on my website, this lab tested our cannabis and here's the results, Health Canada will call that lab and say, you're going to lose your license. You can't test dispensary cannabis. So I can put out whatever results I want, but only I know if I'm telling the truth or not. I can't tell you which lab did the results. And so that leaves us in a very difficult position. We also do our own study. The first thing we do when we get raw buds into our dispensary is look at them under a microscope, and I would encourage members to do the same thing. You can see a lot in terms of mold, mildew, the quality of the trichomes, the resinous glands, if they're there, if they're ripe. That's just the first step. If most of it doesn't pass that, then we will do a taste test on it. Someone will smoke a little bit of it. You can tell if there's chemical contaminants, if it's been over-fertilized. Then we'll send it to a lab if we can, and then after that, if it meets all the standards, we'll put it on our shelves. And with edibles and other products, we've actually found with edibles, we typically supply our producers with our cannabis or with an extract. So we know they're getting a standardized amount, we know where it comes from, and we can give them the same strain or a very similar product to help them standardize what they're making. And a lot of edible makers don't use raw buds. They will use an extract, so they can make something of a known potency and then put that into their product, helping them to standardize the dosages. As to age limits, if I was in charge of the world, I'd make it 16 years old to buy cannabis from a legal place. That being said, I'm happy with the limit being the same as alcohol. That's not a problem. But one thing I see lacking in this legislation is there's no allowance for a parent to give cannabis to their child. You can give alcohol to your children at pretty much any age. A lot of young kids have a half glass of wine with dinner. We don't criminalize those parents. But if that parent were to give their children cannabis or share a joint with their 17-year-old child or something, they could be criminalized and face some serious repercussions. So that, I think, is an issue. To me, the use of cannabis by youth is a family issue and should be determined at the family level. And this legislation doesn't allow for any sort of family decisions on that, which I think is really a big problem.
Great help.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions. Now we go to Mr. Carrie. Mr. Carrie. Mr. Oliver. We'll get it.
Thank you, and thank you very much for your testimony. This is our last day of a full week of testimony on this bill, and from people in the industry and from different walks of life on it. By the end of this week, we'll have heard from 100 or more different witnesses. So it's been quite excellent. If we'd done this in our normal process, we would have been at it for about 3 months. This has really allowed us to delve deeply into the issues, and it's allowed us to compare and contrast testimony that's often difficult to do when you have it stretched out so much. So edibles is the one that I think when we come to clause by clause, it'll be one that we're really reviewing. I think edibles right now are excluded from the legal definition of marijuana, so they wouldn't be permitted. So I'm just going to give you what I've heard in terms of the pros for including and the cons for excluding, and just ask if there's anything that I'm missing in the analysis of it. So on the positive for including edibles, I've heard public health, that otherwise we're encouraging smoking and ingesting of cannabis through smoking. Edibles give you a healthier alternative for ingesting cannabis. Second, I've heard is that if we don't bring it into the legal market, then it really does allow the black market or the whatever market to really continue and grow in that particular market space. And I think Mr. Larsen spoke to that quite pointedly. Those are the two reasons I've heard for inclusion. On the reasons for excluding, I've heard this is a social change, a social experiment for Canada. Go slow, see how what you've got is working before you push on to greater market. Kids access seems to be, and kids accidental ingestion seems to be higher with edibles than with products that you need to smoke. It's hard to regulate and hard to inspect, and there's more complexity in edibles than in the sort of more raw plant. Although with the work in Colorado that they've done, I think there's some pretty good and easily adapted regulations that are in place. And the fourth point has been, what the heck? It's easy to make at home. If people want the edibles, they can go get them. So those are the sort of the pros and the cons. Is there anything, I kind of rambled through them quickly, is there anything else you think I should know as we're thinking about the pros and cons of edibles? Anything you'd add to those lists?
Excuse me. Just a very slight clarification on your first point. With edibles, you do avoid any of the possible pulmonary effects of smoking. There is one concern that I think is a little bit greater with edibles, and that is driving. And the fact that with an inhaled product, you can quickly recognize what the effects are and give yourself time to overcome those effects or to get back to a safe place to be driving, but with edibles, it's possible that you would not realize that you haven't felt the full effects and potentially get behind the wheel. So that's
Titration and speed of the digestion is different.
right. It looks like Mr. Vandry has something.
Just go ahead.
So in the laboratory studies that we've done where we acutely dose people with different routes of administration, I think it's important to note that when we give people smoked cannabis versus edible cannabis, the magnitude of drug effects and the types of effects are identical. It's really just the differences in the time course of the effects. So I have not seen any evidence that eating it is more dangerous than smoking it. Nor I would disagree in the argument that you can't perceive the intoxication when you eat it. People are very aware that they're intoxicated. The challenge is in detecting edible cannabis in a driver who's impaired versus not, but that's a problem across the board, independent of route of administration, but is a little bit different in edibles in that you get lower blood concentrations.
So just quickly, would you recommend, one by all three of you, would you recommend Canada include edibles in their allowable, or would you support the slower pace that's been proposed in the legislation? Just if you want each to address it, Mr. Larsen.
I support adding edibles and also other extracts as well, hashish and all those kind of things, both smokable and edible. That's got to be part of legalization. You're really only allowing the buds is missing out on a large portion of this, and so I absolutely think this should be included. And I don't, this go slow thing. We've been going slow since 1971. It's time to act and not to go slow.
Okay. Mr. Vigil?
I think ultimately they should be included, but it's very important to get it right. And if that takes some time and some learning from the smoked market, then I would be in agreement with that.
And sir, Dr.
Yeah, sure. My personal recommendation would be in favor of regulation and quality control over all products. I think that's in the greater public good rather than just allowing one version and then continuing to have black market product available that you don't know what's in it. I think that makes the most sense.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we go to Mr. Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the panel. My first question to Dr. Vandry. As a cannabis researcher, you mentioned that you evaluate label information on products to determine whether they're accurate or not. That is correct. In Colorado and Washington State, the licensed producers, have you found that their labeling is quite accurate?
So again, I've not conducted any testing in Colorado. The state of Colorado does their own testing, and maybe Mr. Vigil could talk about the outcomes of what the tests is that they've done. The testing that I've done in Washington has been limited to medical cannabis dispensaries, which at the time were distinct from non-medical testing dispensaries. I believe at that time that the regulations over products being sold in medical cannabis dispensaries were not very rigorous, and the testing that we found there indicated that most of the products were inaccurately labeled.
Interesting. Mr. Virgil, accidental exposure that you mentioned in your remarks about incidences, do you see a lot of that occurring in your neck of the woods?
So the term "a lot" is I think important to comment on because we have seen an increase, as I mentioned, in both poison center calls and emergency department visits relative to other reasons that people are making those calls.
I'm referring specifically to accidental exposure.
Okay, right. So
children.
Right. So let's focus on the 0 to 8 year age group for accidental exposure, and so poison center calls, about 1 in 10,000 children at the peak in Colorado. There was a call related to marijuana. I'll also mention that that outcomes were not, there weren't severe outcomes related to that. It was, the majority of those were just some concern.
Through ingestion of an edible?
Right.
Or,
well, so some portion of those were smokable. Children can pick up a bud and put it in their mouth as well.
Sure.
The majority were edibles.
So your thoughts on home cultivation, 4 plants per household, just your thoughts on that. Do you think that should be allowed?
I think it's going to happen whether you allow it or not. And so again, you know, bringing something into the regulated market is probably better than having it unregulated. In Colorado, for home grows, the real problem that we've run into is extended plant counts and the ability for a caretaker in the medical realm to grow for multiple people, so that you have these very large grows that are, you know, on paper are legal, but are really contributing to black market and diversion.
Mr. Larsen, I don't know where BC is going to go with their distribution decisions, whether it's dispensaries or LCBO. I don't even know if they have a liquor control board in BC or not, but you've heard where they're going here in Ontario, and they've already started to shut down some dispensaries and arrest the individuals inside, and it's occurred in your environment as well, and I'm certain. If the BC government determines that you cannot do this, you indicate that you will continue to have customers shop with you anyways, and I just question that. You will not be able to allow, I don't know, do you have a storefront right now? I have no idea about dispensaries, Mr. Larsen, because I've never been in one, and perhaps I'll come and visit yours just to learn some more about it, but I just don't know how you will continue to operate if your government in BC decides to have it in a more controlled environment.
Well, that's an interesting point. You know, let's make it clear. They are trying their hardest in Ontario to get rid of dispensaries already. They've been trying for a while, and they are failing miserably. And there are dispensaries in every major city in Canada, and most minor ones now. Just like bong shops. And I told you, bongs are illegal too. And we fought, we got raided, people went to jail over bongs big time in the 1990s. The problem that you have enforcing these laws is that the courts are not willing to give us severe penalties. And we have an overburdened justice system. They laid hundreds of charges, or dozens of charges in Toronto, and they've only kept a handful of them. On the cannabis culture raid, when they went after Mark and Jody Emery and a few others, not a single one of their suppliers was arrested or charged. They're selling cannabis from many companies who have labeling, websites, phone numbers, you can call them, people sell extracts. They could easily, if they wanted to spend the time and effort, go after these people. Then they're not, because the police and our justice system are not able to handle this kind of mass civil disobedience campaign that we're engaging in. We like the phrase overgrowing the government. There's too many of us willing to go to the end on this that you can't keep up. And do you really want to put me in jail for selling cannabis? Is that where you think I belong? Because I'm going to keep doing it, and that's going to be the only option. I'm going to keep giving away seeds. I'm going to keep using cannabis.
Do you charge tax on your products? GST, PST?
Some dispensaries do, some don't. We don't right now, but we're on the transitioning towards that, and I would be happy to do that. And you know, we're happy to follow reasonable regulations. I'm not an anarchist who doesn't want to follow the rules, but if the rules are saying I can't operate and I can't exist, then of course we're gonna break those rules.
Paying taxes? Do you file?
Oh yeah, we file taxes. All of our staff are registered. We do all the deductions and all those kind of things as best we can. I can't speak for every dispensary. There are hundreds across Canada. Some operate in many different ways than others. But you can't stop us. You don't have the capability in the policing and the courts to deal with what we're doing. That's why it's been so successful, and we're going to keep doing that. So the rules have to take that into consideration, that there is already a vibrant and dynamic cannabis industry, and we are committed to what we're doing, and that needs to be incorporated into legalization, or else you've got to find a way to compete with us and produce better products at a lower price with a higher selection and higher quality. If you do that, we'll we'll go out of business, and I would consider that a victory on my end. If my dispensary can't operate because there's better, cheaper, higher quality cannabis available from a legal source, then I won. I don't need to run a dispensary. I just want cannabis to be legal and available, and so that's how I see it. But until that day comes, as long as my dispensary can provide products that aren't legally available that people want to get, we'll keep doing it.
Well, now I have to stop you. So, Dr. Alfson, it's your turn.
Right, thank you very much. I have the disadvantage of being down the list so that a lot of the questions